I think one of the big trends driving elections of recent years, and one of the big disconnects between a lot of our political and media commentary and life as it's being lived by the majority of Americans, is the difference between the top line employment figures and the financial realities for people in the workforce. And our next guest wrote a very useful article about that. I wanted to bring her on to talk about it. Elizabeth Grossman is the author of a book entitled Chasing Molecules, and she's written a number of others as well. Her other writing has appeared in a lot of places you might be reading: Mother Jones, The Nation, Salon, The Washington Post, elsewhere. And her recent piece, which is the one I'm referring to, which was in the magazine In These Times, a little tough to say, is More U.S. Workers Have Highly Volatile, Unstable Incomes. So Elizabeth Grossman, welcome to the program.
And thanks for having me on the show.
It's our pleasure. And first of all, you begin your article by citing some statistics, the stock market being at record highs, unemployment, and that's what I mean by the top line unemployment, a number being at its lowest level since. But as you also mentioned, income inequality is stubbornly high. In fact, it's reached record levels in certain ways. And then you go on to talk about the problem of people who are working part-time or would rather be working full-time, and then pivot to a new report called A New Safety Net for an Era of Unstable Earnings. What do we mean by unstable earnings?
Well, what this report, which was written by various experts at the Century Foundation and also the National Employment Law Project, looked at is, as you mentioned, the fact that there are more Americans than ever that are working part-time, a great many of them involuntarily working part-time after losing full-time steady employment. And we also now have an extraordinarily large number of people who are either self-employed or working as independent contractors with erratic schedules. And what this all adds up to, both the part-time and the erratic self-employed schedules, are incomes that don't work the way people assumed incomes were going to when you were on salary, with the same paycheck week to week, month to month, but that can vary enormously from month to month. And one of the things that this report found, that people who are working part-time or in these non-traditional situations, 3 out of 5 of them experienced at least as much as a 50% drop in month-to-month income, and about half of them sometimes experienced 100% changes in their month-to-month income. So that's what the report is talking about in terms of unstable and volatile income.
So this is, and I think it's a really important categorization to talk about people with unstable incomes, because there's been a lot of discussion, for example, about the gig economy, as they call it, or the Uber economy, where people work on a per service basis online. But this is what people don't realize is that this is an even broader category that includes those people, but also includes, for example, fast food workers who may work 30 hours one week, 10 hours the next, 40 hours the next. It's unpredictable, and they don't know from week to week, month to month, what their income is going to be. So this is a lot of people fit this category, right?
Exactly. And in a lot of ways, it's becoming a new reality for the American workforce. And one of the things that the report looked at was the fact that policy in terms of employment safety nets, what people consider traditional employment benefits, those policies haven't really caught up with this new reality. And as you say, it is an enormous spectrum of people, from low-wage workers in service, retail, hospitality, fast food, and other restaurant jobs, the large number of people who work on a temp basis in industry and construction and manufacturing. And then it includes lots of people who might put themselves at a different end of the workforce spectrum simply because they're highly educated, but because of the information age job structure that you alluded to, the so-called gig economy, lots of people are working as independent contractors or freelancers who might have had full-time employment before.
Yeah, and I think the significance of this, as you rightly point out, Elizabeth Grossman, in this, the significance of this change and the significance studied in the Century Foundation and National Employment Law Project report is that we have a social contract and a system of benefits that's, for a lot of people, predicated on the assumption that you're working full time. So that affects whether you get vacation pay, you're more likely to get vacation pay, sick leave, and just the steadiness of income, knowing from month to month how much you're going to have in your pocket. It links to the fact that a huge percentage of Americans wouldn't be able to face a $400 or a $1,000 financial emergency. They wouldn't be able to cover it. So there are a variety of insecurities and stresses and vulnerabilities that people face as a result of this shift in our economy, as a result of this growing set of people with unstable incomes. So the report, as I understand it, also attempts to address those needs. Is that correct?
Yeah, what the report does is try to separate out some of these different tiers of vulnerability that you were describing. The fact that if you work part-time, and certainly if you're self-employed, you are not eligible for traditional unemployment benefits. You may not be eligible for any health insurance, any family leave, let alone any vacation leave. And some states in the wake of the Great Recession have tried to begin to address certainly the part-time situation, but it's only a very small percent of states that have any such benefits. So what the report is looking at is how policies, both at the federal and more local level, could start to shift the structure of unemployment benefits so that it really would help part-time workers who, in a way, are now actually penalized by having traditional unemployment benefits reduced if they actually start working part-time or they take a freelance gig. You're not supposed to do that under the current structure. Right. And it also looked at some other programs that are a little bit more innovative that could start to address the whole reality of the fact that so many people don't work on a traditional employment basis.
Well, what were some of those innovative programs? Because I think when you look at the other areas of vulnerability beyond unemployment insurance, they're huge. I mean, for one thing, obviously the variation in income is a problem. Childcare is a problem. You know, I've interviewed fast food workers who don't know from week to week whether they'll be working the evening shift or the morning shift. And nobody, it seems, can afford childcare these days, especially for very young children. There's a variety of medical coverage, other forms of benefit coverage. So what are some of these innovative programs we're talking about?
Sure. Well, there are the issue of the erratic schedules, people being called for shifts but not actually being hired on. There is some legislation out there. Who knows what's going to happen in the current new Congress, but there already are some pieces of policy out there both at the state and local level, and certain companies are already trying to take this on board to guarantee people more stable schedules so they can address childcare needs, education needs, and you can't say you're going to show up for a second job if you don't know when your first job is going to need you.
Right. Right.
So there are some things in place to try to address the erratic schedule and not penalizing people if they show up for a shift and then the employer says, sorry, we don't need you. But beyond that, some of the things the report authors are looking at are broadening support for what are called work share programs, some of which are already being tried out. And a lot of this depends on the employer deciding that rather to do wholesale layoffs will reduce hours across a number of employees so that people can retain their jobs, but there will be some financing to help cover the gap. Looking at that, some other things that are being looked at are in terms of the people who are freelancers or working in the gig economy. And this is a little more out there in terms of reality and implementation, looking at ways to have tax credits that would address some of the swings in earnings, and perhaps also building on apparently in some places in Europe where there are professional conjoin that will together to get some benefits where they need them. So it's pretty complicated, but and it will require lots of different solutions. But since there are now almost 20 million Americans who work solely on freelance incomes, and I think the number was 45% more people are working part-time than they were 10 years ago. This is a huge number of people who have these issues.
Yeah, and if you combine that, and just parenthetically, by the way, and again, we're talking with Elizabeth Grossman about her article in These Times. If you combine that with the number of people who have left the workforce, people of working age who have left the workforce, I think one of my takeaways from this is that the economy isn't as good as it looks just from the top line numbers, and two is that you're talking about something in the order of 20 million Americans who really urgently need help because the job situation they have is in some way or another not meeting fundamental life needs. Is that a fair interpretation of what
I think that's a pretty close interpretation of what these the report authors have been looking at, because even though, again, today the administration noted that unemployment is, below 5%, which is maybe half of what the unemployment level was at the depths of the big recession. But the job market isn't what it used to be or what it could be, and there's this huge amount of vulnerability for a growing number of people. So yeah, I think that is a very accurate assessment, that maybe at the top, numerically, it looks good. It's I don't know, maybe one way to describe it, it's very soft in the middle, and there just aren't adequate support systems for the way more and more people are currently working.
Well, I think that's a very, very important point, and so thanks for writing this up. And I like the way you wrote it up in These Times. It's so hard to say, in These Times, which is you linked the Century Foundation NELP report with some other data as well. I think that's very important, so I encourage people to go find your article. And so thanks for reporting on it, Elizabeth Grossman, and thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thanks for the invitation, and thanks for tracking down the piece.